Coming up next, Avatar, unbelievable and available. Coming up next, The Ant and the Aardvark. Coming up next, Digimon Adventure. Coming up next, Inazuma 11. Coming up next, Gorillas. Coming up next, Gorillas. Coming up next, Demon Slayer. Coming up next, My Hero Academia. Coming up next, Yokai Watch. Coming up next, Betty Boop. Coming up next, Pokemon. Coming up next, Happy Tree Friends. Coming up next, Panty and Stocking with Garter Belt. Coming up next, Dick Figures. Coming up next, Counterfeit Cat. Coming up next, Littlest Jimmy Neutron. Coming up next, Clifford the Big Red Dog. Coming up next, Making Fiends. Coming up next, Blue's Clues. Coming up next, Hey Arnold. Coming up next, Fishtronaut. Coming up next, Fishtronaut McStuffins. Coming up next, Stoked. Coming up next, 16. Coming up next, Wacky Races. Coming up next, Littlest Ever. Coming up next, Xavier Riddle. Coming up next, Ralph. Coming up next, South Park. Coming up next, The Ricky Gervais Show. Coming up next, Doki. Coming up next, Doc. Coming up next, Tim Burton. Coming up next, Burtonburger. Coming up next, Digimon. Coming up next, Doc McStuffins.